Tyler, will you do me a favor? I just need 5 copies. Can you take yours and make 5 copies? I think so. I'm sure I need 5. If it's past that, they just have to listen, which is their sadness. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. We have made it all the way to week 11. Week 11. So, if that means you're sick of me, I understand. Luckily, next week you have a chance to not have to deal with me anymore. So, you guys, don't forget, if you haven't signed up, our life group sign-ups need to be turned in. We need to have our life group leaders give you guys calls and reach out for whatever you sign up for. That way we can kind of just make sure everybody knows what's going on. But if you decide you want to join us for the wilderness wanderings, that'll be really great. We're gonna start with the Exodus, and then we'll move our way through. And because I think the Exodus makes a big benchmark in understanding how the wilderness wanderings go. And so we'll go through that starting next week. But for now, this is lesson 11 in the Life of Joseph study. I entitled this Forgiveness and Death. So promising. Forgiveness and death. So as we get going today, we're going to be working through this final chapter in the life of Joseph. It's also the final chapter in the book of Genesis, go figure. And it has one of the more well-known verses in regard to God's providence. It has one of the more well-known verses in regards to God's providence. So as we go through today, I want you to think about this. Everybody in this room has gone through grieving and difficulty. And I know we've talked about that a lot because when you go through Philippians, you get a lot about trials and tribulations and persecutions and grieving and difficulty. And when you go through Joseph, you get a lot of trials and tribulations, grieving and difficulty. But as we go through life, you also get a lot of trial and tribulation, grieving and difficulty. And all these books were written from real people who existed and went through real problems. So how do we deal with them? What is our attitude in regard to what has happened to us, around us? Do we have the proper way that we grieve? Are we, punching walls back somewhere because we're unhappy? Do we hold on to unforgiveness? Let's see Jacob's example as we look at this last chapter, and we're also going to look at the one that Jacob is ultimately pointing to. So the first, I said Jacob and I meant Joseph. The one Joseph is ultimately pointing to. It does. If you couldn't hear that, she stood up for me. She said it begins with J. So that's a win. I'm just saying. Thank you for that. But it's because the first part's about Jacob, so I gotta defend this somehow. No, it was just a faux pas. So the death of Jacob in verses 1 through 13. So the first thing we're going to look at, Joseph's father is being embalmed. I'm sure everyone thought they were going to hear about that today. So let's read. We're going to read the whole chapter today. We're going to enjoy getting into the text, but we're going to read together, hopefully. So can someone read verse 1 pretty loud? All right, verse 2. Verse 3 says, "And 40 days were fulfilled for him, for so are fulfilled the days which are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days." So as we hop into chapter 50, you'll note that it has really the same topic that was going on at the end of 49. It's all about the death of Jacob, the death of God's chosen man, Israel, the one who wrestled with God. And as we look at that, it does so in an interesting way. In chapter 49, you look at Jacob's death from the view of Jacob's faith in God. He's coming to the end and he's saying, look, God is going to do this. God is going to bring you out of Egypt, and because of that, don't bury me here. Bury me where my fathers are. He knew that God was going to complete what he said. But now you get the other side of it. Now you get the people who are still around. Now you get the grieving families that are dealing with the loss of a loved one. Now, if anyone in here has had a loved one die, I'm sure a vast majority of us have at this point. In my family that I can remember, I've only had one person die, but they lived far away and I couldn't go to the funeral. That said, I get to be a part of a lot of funerals, so I have a pretty good idea of how the process works. But you see that they had to deal with some of these situations even in the midst of grief. Unfortunately, time does not stop when you have an awful thing happen to you. Things still need done. You need to have them be embalmed. You need to have the funeral plan. You need to have all these things going on. And so the family is dealing with all these things on their own, seemingly. Now, embalming is really interesting. If you think about when this takes place, this is taking place probably in the 1800s BC. So this is pretty incredible that they had embalming all the way back then. This is a process that they will have been going through for many years. But the idea is that you remove the insides, you remove the moisture in the body, and it minimizes decay. It makes things to where people are recognizable for an extended period of time. There are mummies from the 15th century BC that they think they can still give you a pretty good idea of what they would have looked like when they were alive, which is pretty incredible. Now, I don't know where the idea for this came from. I don't know that I want to know, but nonetheless, it was a common practice by this day. This had been done since at least the 2600s BC, and so it was something they knew how to do to some degree or another. Just like everything else, they get better at it as time continues and how much money you pay for it. The embalming process took at least 40 days. Depending on who you read, some suggest that it could take up to 70 days, depending on what's going on. But what we do see is you see the people mourn for 70 days. Different suggestions are given for this length of time. Some say that the pharaohs you would mourn 72 days for. I don't know if that's true or not, but it was a commentary that I read. There's something else that I heard, that there's a Jewish custom that 70 was the number of nations in the world. And so on that note, if that's the case, then you almost have this picture of the whole world mourning at the death of God's chosen, which is pretty cool. But what we do know is it was noted that they had this extended time of mourning. It was a custom for the Egyptian people. And just like the Israelites, they would later even have people like professional mourners. I don't know about you guys, I never thought about paying somebody to come cry at a funeral or be excited at a wedding or anything like that. But you have to understand the Egyptians had very intense death rituals. They viewed the afterlife in a very interesting way. And what you had at your death represented what you were going to have in their mind in the afterlife. So for the Egyptian side of this, the pagan side of this, they probably felt a compulsion to do this. On Joseph and his family's side, knowing the true God, they were just going through a regular grieving process of losing a loved one. I think it's important to note it wasn't just it happened and everything was fine. And I think people need to understand it's okay to grieve. It's okay to be sad and struggle with the losing of a loved one, or even if you know where they are. It's okay to miss them. It's not okay to stay in it, though. And so what they did is they had an appointed time this was to be done. So next we see Joseph requests bereavement. So this is Genesis 50, verses 4 through 6. So somebody read 4 loudly, please. Five. Verse 6. You know, that's the way I can tell who's listening is, does everybody turn the paper at the same time? I'm just kidding, but at least I know you could hear. But as we go through this, you see that Joseph makes his request to the household of Pharaoh, but not Pharaoh himself. I don't know about you guys, I found that really interesting when I read the chapter. This Joseph, who has, lived in prominence, he was basically the chief ruler in Egypt underneath Pharaoh, does not find it fitting to go to Pharaoh. Can anyone give any suggestions for why they think that might be the case?
Personal.
It was personal. Anybody else? Because he was a Hebrew? Okay. So when I first read it, my first thought was, okay, maybe it's a different Pharaoh. Maybe he doesn't have the same rapport. But as I read more on it, I think there is a better answer. It may be that because he's mourning, generally when you're mourning, you're not as nice looking as you'd like to be. You're not clean shaven. You're not prepped to, meet a king. The idea there is that several people, several countries would have had this custom that you don't come before the king while mourning. You can see that later in the lives of, in Mordecai, if you're familiar with Esther chapter 4. Esther is in the palace, and she's told of Mordecai outside the gates in like sackcloth and ashes, and is like, why are you freaking out? What is going on? And the reason he can't come in the gates, according to Esther 4:2, it says, and he came before the gates, for none might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. So it's probably a respect thing. He's probably being kind and gracious and realizing his place, that although he has familiarity with this Pharaoh, with this king, that he has an obligation to interact with him in an appropriate way. And so he comes and he makes a request to their family, to the household of Pharaoh, and says, hey, please let me go bury my father where he asked. Now, some suggested, when you read that, you see Jacob says he dug the cave. When we think of a cave, we kind of just think of an open area. We don't really think about anybody digging pieces out of it. He may have added areas to it. Maybe it wasn't as big as it is now. And some people think this is Jacob attributing to himself what Abraham had done. And whether that's the case, I don't know. But what I do know is Jacob made them promise they were going to do what? Take him out of Egypt. They were going to bury him with his family. So they're trying to do that. He makes the request, and he gets a response. So Joseph and Egypt will mourn over the death of Jacob. So that continues. But Genesis 50, verse 7. Somebody read verse 7. And verse 8. Verse 9. Verse 10. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning in the floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians." Wherefore the name of it was called Abel Mizraim, which is beyond Jordan. Somebody read verse 12. And 13. All right, I'm going to teach you guys a secret when you're reading the Bible out loud. Say it with confidence and no one will question you. Seriously, though, I have no idea how you say some of these words. I say Mamre because that's how I've always pronounced it. One day I said Selah, or was it Salah? I said Salah, and they're like, no, it's Selah. And I'm like, great, you speak Hebrew. And I was like, well, most of the time, nobody will catch you on it. So if you ever get stuck on a name, just go for it. It'll be all right. So this funeral would have a massive entourage. It included not only family, but extensive amounts of the Egyptians. Remember, we talked a couple weeks ago that Jacob actually blessed Pharaoh. And we said that was only possible because the less is blessed by the greater. There was some recognition that Jacob was a great man, being the father of Joseph who came and saved the people, being the man chosen by God who gave the understanding of the dream that could save the people. There was great respect for Jacob, for Joseph, for this family because of what they did in Egypt. The mourning of the people, though, came near Jordan. I can tell you what, I've never seen a place that was renamed because there were so many people doing one action there. Could you imagine they renamed this place, literally meaning the mourning of Egypt? Abel Mizraim, the mourning of Egypt. It says his sons kept his promise. They required him to be buried where he said. This was their father's final wish, and I think it also is really interesting, and I mentioned this the other week. Jacob was not buried with Rachel. He was buried with his fathers and with Leah, who was his first wife. So it's really kind of interesting. He spends all this time making, Rachel the favorite, crying over Rachel's kids, ostracizing his sons, setting up the whole situation where Joseph could go into Egypt, be taken, be in slavery, be in servanthood, come up to the highest thing underneath Pharaoh, and it was all started with favoritism. And then in his death, he doesn't even pick to be next to her. It's just kind of interesting. He is one of the patriarchs. He wanted to be with his parents. That's fair. But the interesting thing to me is he didn't move Rachel there. It's just interesting. Once again, Jacob is buried with the patriarchs and Leah. I would say that the sons doing this showed they're fulfilling their promise, that showed that they had faith in the faithfulness of what God said he was going to accomplish. They believed God at his promise. So the next thing we're going to see in general is the providence of God, the providence of God. The brothers fear Joseph now that their father is dead. I don't know about you guys, sometimes I'm very brave while my mother is in the room. Or I was, if that makes sense. I could mess with my sister, and as long as my mom didn't see it and she responded to me, I would probably get away with it, and my mom would get on her and not me. Any siblings in here know what that's about. All right. Or, if we have guests over, I can pick on my wife a little bit, and she won't beat me up while they're there. It's great. Just a little bit once they leave. Don't check my arms for bruises. Just kidding. She's good. She doesn't beat me up normally. Okay. She said she'll encourage her to beat me up instead. All right. All right, Genesis 50, verses 14 and 15. Somebody read verse 14. Verse 15.
Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead. They said, Joseph will peradventure hate us, and will certainly requite us all the evil which we did unto him.
Okay. So, again, they were safe while Dad was around. Dad's gone. What in the world is our brother going to do to us? Cam, there's a day when Cade is going to pay you back, or think about paying you back for things you've done to him. Maybe he felt like you held him under the water too long. I don't know. But they're worried. They're scared of what their brother might do because they deserve it. They know they do. The brothers mirror Jacob in their fear of facing their sibling after wronging him. If you're familiar with the book of Genesis, you'll know the same thing happened with Jacob and Esau. Not quite the same. He didn't sell Esau into slavery or anything. But he stole Esau's blessing. He bought Esau's birthright. He left Esau to where he would have been desolate had God not chosen to bless him. And now, I don't know if you know this, God does actually still bless Esau. He gives him land right next to the people of Israel. But not to the same degree. And so when Esau knew that his dad was sick, his plan was once Dad dies, you're dead too. So Jacob leaves town to get a wife, which he does, 4. Not a good plan. Everybody remember that? Don't marry 4 wives. Goes badly every time. I'm going to spend one more minute on that. Every person in the Bible who marries more than one woman gets into trouble. Don't do it. All right. I don't care what the culture tells you is okay. You're going to end up like David or like Solomon and ruin the entire nation. Don't do it. Now, maybe you won't be king when it happens, fine, but don't do it. Now, think about this. I mean, Jacob knows he's wronged his brother, Esau, long, long ago. He's gone for 20 years. He's still scared when he's coming back. And you have almost the same scenario. It's said that Jacob has died at 147 years old. He was finally seen again by Joseph at 130. And so it's been 17 years they've been semi-reunited, but not without Dad. They were separate for about 22 years. And they still have this guilt upon them. They still know if he came after us, he would be right to do so, and we don't want that to happen. I want to warn you guys, personal guilt is not easily assuaged. We need to be very careful in what we do because the enjoyment will last a minute and the consequences last far longer. We need to make sure we're not doing something that's going to bother us or ruin us for the next 20, 40 years in this scenario. It's going to leave you living in fear and desperation. But it's important to note your actions stay with you. Even if not in a formal judgment sense, you may be keeping it and judging yourself that whole time. So let's see what the brothers do. They attempt to manipulate Joseph. It's a great answer. He's going to be upset with us. Let's try to manipulate him. It's going to make him way happier. All right, verse 16. Who's got it? Now, Joseph, don't you know, before Dad died, he had a special message. What is it? Verse 17. Now, Joseph, don't you know you got to forgive your brothers? Dad said it, I promise. You have to forgive us because it was Dad's dying wish. First off, it's kind of awful that they're trying to take advantage of that situation. But how does it make him respond? It says, and Joseph wept when they spake unto him. The fact that they even think that about him hurts him. Verse 18.
Brethren also went, fell down before his face. They said, Behold, thy servant.
As if that wasn't already the case. The guy's second in command under Pharaoh. If he tells you to do something, I don't care if he is little brother. You got to go do it. But you see, they're trying to manipulate him. They're trying to say, look, this was Dad's dying wish. You have to forgive us. But this attempt gave Joseph so much grief. You know what I think? I think Joseph had forgiven them 20 years ago. And the fact that they're still playing it over in their mind, and to him, it's like, you obviously don't trust me. You don't trust my character. Like, how do you not know? I think Joseph's answer in this is so awesome. So you see that Joseph has an eternal perspective. It gives hope that can diminish pain. Genesis 50, 19 through 21. Somebody read 19. 20. And 21. Man, I always wondered what it was like to have something said in stereo. You see, Joseph doesn't hold a grudge. He says he's not here to judge them. God's the one who's going to do any of the judgment. It's not him. But you know what he notes? He notes that what they meant for evil, God meant for good. I think this is really interesting. I was actually having an embarrassing long conversation last night with some friends about Bible stuff. We were talking about really, really complicated, complex topics that are way deeper than we understand. And one of the verses that came up was Genesis 50:20. And so we're like, you know, I wonder what it means when it says they meant it for evil, they thought it for evil, God meant it for good. How does that work? Were they both active in that? Were they both passive? Who was passive? Who was active? And what you'll find if you look into it on the Greek side of things is they're both middle verbs, because the idea is one thought it. So they thought to do it. They had an active role in it, but they also had a passive role. The thought came into their mind. It happened to them. But God does too. So at the same time, when someone is doing evil, when terrible things are happening, God had already planned that. He had purposed it. He had a plan for it, but also that thought happened in his mind. He planned it in an active sense, but he also has them doing it in an active sense. There's a way where both are doing it at the same time. I heard a description of this, and someone said it this way. It's kind of 100% this, 100% this kind of thing, and it's kind of weird. If Hamlet said something in the story of Hamlet, but Shakespeare wrote it, who said it? Well, they both did. Hamlet said it physically in the story, but Shakespeare ultimately is the one who said it and wrote it out and did it. And so God purposed this, but the brothers purposed it. And that's how the brothers did evil and God brought it for good. He knew it was going to happen. He planned it. He purposed it. He moved it through. And it was a beautiful thing. Note that Joseph isn't just looking through history with rose-colored glasses. He knows that his brothers did him evil. He's not hiding it or saying, no, what you did to me wasn't that bad. He's like, no, what you did was evil, and you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. He knew there would be a greater purpose behind suffering. In doing all that was done, God helped the Israelites survive. He fulfilled his promise that he made to Abraham. In Genesis 15, if you're familiar with Genesis 15, God is talking to Abraham. Abraham says, God, how do I know you're going to fulfill this promise? I don't have any kids yet. Should I have this steward be my heir? And God's like, no, I'm going to give you a son. And a couple chapters later, he's like, great, I have Ishmael. And God's like, no, I'm going to give you a son. But if you're in Genesis 15, the other thing that you see happen, you see that Abraham believes God. It's counted to him for righteousness. And then 10 verses later, God promises Abraham that his people are going to go in a land where they're strangers for 400 years. And then they'll come out and be the nation that he called them to be. And so God is initiating the promise he made 35 chapters ago to Abraham. He's putting them in that land where they're strangers. The people are already multiplying, as you read in chapters earlier. They already are gaining an immense amount of substance. They get so powerful that as you go into Exodus, they says, these people are too great. We have to do something to stop them. They start trying to kill off all the male children. They have to enslave them because they are getting to be too incredible. But God has done what he promised. The other thing you see here is you see Joseph act as another type of Christ. He was wrong, but he blessed others. Man, who does that sound like? How about 1 Peter 2:24? Who in his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, being dead to sins, should live unto righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. Man, what happened to Joseph was done to the saving of his nation. And what happened to Christ was done to the saving of all that are in him. It's done for the salvation to be possible for all the world. Note that he was humbled and then highly exalted. He was the favorite son of a wealthy man. And he went from being that to being a servant in a guard's house. Now, chief guard, but still a guard's house. And we see that happen in Jesus Christ. Philippians 2:5-11, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but it says he made himself of no reputation, took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And Jesus, being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself, and he became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. It says, wherefore God also highly exalted him, and given him a name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of things in heaven and things in earth and things under the earth. Let's say verse 11 together. I think it fits. And that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Amen. We also see that there were those that wronged him. When they seek forgiveness, he grants it. We know that God does that for us, and God expects us to do that for others. Ephesians 4:32, be kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven you. He speaks good, and he speaks kindly to them. You know the coolest thing? The Bible says Jesus ever lives to intercede for us. How easy it would be to toss us aside and say, man, those people are a mess. I can't stand Alex. He messed that up again. It's the 14th time this week. Somebody's got to get that guy. Gabriel, go punch him. I don't know. But what's happening, though, is we see that God offers us goodness. Now, we're still expected to repent, don't get me wrong. But he offers us goodness. He speaks well and kind to us. He cares for us. He stays with us. Finally, we see the legacy of Joseph. Joseph had a long and full life, according to Genesis 50. Somebody read verse 22. Yeah, he dwelt in Egypt and he lived 110 years. Verse 23. Ephraim. Yep. So you've got Ephraim and Manasseh, and it says they had children up to the third generation. That's pretty incredible. That is 4 generations below Joseph. So his sons had 3 generations. Does anybody in here have son, grandson, great-grandson? Anybody here have great-great-grandsons that are alive? You do? Fantastic. That's so cool. I had a great-grandparent, and they died when I was 5, and I don't remember them at all. But man, is it cool to see how God blessed them, and they allowed Joseph to live and see all this family and be an influence on these people. He lived another, say, trying to think, at least 50 or so years after his dad passed away. Joseph has faith in God's promise, and that's why he says what he does at the end of Genesis 50. It says, "And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of the land unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Verse 25. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Joseph believed that God was going to fulfill his promise. He informed the next generation of that what God was going to do. He made it to where he would be easily accessible. They'd be able to find him, get him out of there. They'd know where he was. The plan was Joseph said, God is going to fulfill his promise. He always has. Be ready when it's time. Many people in here have gone through difficulties. I'm assuming not many as difficult as Joseph. There may be some, though. Some people have had horrible things happen in their lives that they lived through, that they've not talked to everybody about, or maybe they have. But how do we let those things affect us? Can we respond in faith to the difficulties we have had and that we will have? Can we know that God can use all things for his good? Do we know that even when we've gone through something terrible, that God may be using it to grow us and change us into the people that we need to be? Are you able to forgive, recognizing that you also have been forgiven? And what kind of legacy will you leave when you leave this earth? Will you tell the next generation, the next 2, the next 3, about what God has done and what he will do? If God wrote your story in a book, what would it say? Well, that ends our Life of Joseph study. Did anybody find anything really interesting in your reading? We've got lots of time today. By that, I mean like 6 minutes. So that's a lot of time. Who read through all the 13 chapters we did? Fantastic. Thank you so much. What's something that stuck out in your reading? How long they lived? Yeah, that was really interesting. To have Jacob live 147 years and be like, I lived a short time. I would guess that he was, you know, I don't know. Some people wear it better than others. I was talking to a gentleman this past week, and he said, I'm in my 90th year, and he's still up, going, walking around, doing things. I mean, he's very, very active. So it's pretty incredible. Some people wear age really well. I'm hoping that the patriarchs were some of those people and not like bedridden, like, gurneyed down to where they were going. But I imagine them as being people who kept their health for a long time. Not that it was perfect, because nobody's is, but that they were able to continue functioning. What else did you guys notice? Joseph didn't complain. Man, do we do that. Things can go wrong just a little bit. And we're like, God, why is this happening to me? Most of the time, we don't even complain to him. We complain to whoever's next to us. Vicky, let me tell you about my day. You wouldn't believe what so-and-so said to me. Yeah, you're probably right. Anyway, what else? That's an interesting question. So for those who can't hear that, she said, was Joseph empowered to live the way he lived, to be a picture of Christ, or was he just that good that he fits as a picture of Christ? Now, I want to clarify a couple things. Every picture of Christ is imperfect. And so God will use even very deeply flawed people. Now, God will highlight things he wants you to get out of them. And so I think maybe what we see in the story of Joseph is what God wanted to highlight, probably not all the negative things that actually exist in him as well. It's wonderful, the things we do see. I would say what we know about Joseph is Joseph knew God had a plan. He knew very effectively that. And it was obvious to him and to the people around him that no matter where he was at, God was with him. And so I think that helped him keep perspective. Sometimes we don't feel that way. Sometimes we don't look that way. And that's really interesting for us because Joseph didn't even have God within him like we do once we're saved. It was just God around him working things out. Sometimes I wonder the same thing. I'm like, how in the world did they do this? Because I'm like, I don't feel like I can do this. It's a really awesome question. What else do you got? Yes, ma'am. Yeah. So it may be to the point where you're recognizing that the lifetimes are definitely shortening since the time of Noah. But if you look at Abraham, if you look at Terah, if you look at Isaac, all these men had long lives. And again, this is the line that God is going to use. But the lifetimes are definitely shortening. It may be that most people's have already shortened to the point that it was very uncommon to see someone live 130 years. And so that might be the case, why it was such a surprise to Pharaoh he was that old. And then to live to 147, again, they recognized God was doing something special in this man. And then you see Joseph live to 110, which again is still an extensive life, even if it's not the full 120 years. It really depends. I don't think God obviously was making the promise that as soon as the flood happens, it's 120 years is all you get. But obviously, I think it's definitely trending towards that direction. And even later, it says the years of man are 70 years, 80 if he's lucky. And so you have this kind of picture where it's going downward. I hesitate with that. So here's what I would say I understand that of. I would more understand brethren to be the children of Israel, not like specifically children, but his family. He's talking to the people that are going to survive him and keep going. I think his actual brothers, because they all would have been older, either probably had died or were very close like he was. So I wouldn't take that brethren quite as literally. I thought I saw one hand over here, and I don't want to. Go ahead. Yeah. That is good. Yeah. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the study. Unfortunately, our time is up. There's people waiting, so we've got to call it. Thank you so much, and hopefully I'll see you around for the Wilderness Wanderings or some other class. Thank you, guys.